Thank you all for joining us online today for this webinar, community webinar. We're here today to provide an overview of the proposed planning scheme amendment for the Thornbury Park Heritage Estate. Today is a chance for you to learn more about the heritage significance of the precinct and the proposed controls. And just to note, first up, that you would have probably heard a message say this, that today's session is going to be recorded and it will also be posted on the council's website following the session, and we'll give you some pointers where to access that. Before we go any further, I'd like to start the meeting with an acknowledgement of country. Thanks. Darebin City Council acknowledges the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people as the traditional owners and custodians of the land we now call Darebin, and pays respect to their elders past, present and emerging. Council pays respect to all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Darebin and recognises and pays tribute to the diverse culture, resilience and heritage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We acknowledge the leadership of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and the right to self-determination in the spirit of mutual understanding and respect, its ongoing contribution and its significant value. Excuse me. My name is Ross Hornsey, and I'll be leading facilitation of today's online session. I'm also joined by my colleagues Jess Buckley and Liz Webster, who will be assisting with note-taking and running the tech behind the scenes. From Council, we're joined by Stevie Myers, Acting Manager of Strategic Planning, Sophie Jordan, Acting Coordinator, Strategic Planning, as well as other representatives from the team, including Naomi Kung and Simon Chitre. We'll hear shortly from Sophie, who will be providing more detail about Council's work in this space. We've also got Anthony Hemingway from RBA, who were engaged by Council to prepare the heritage study that informed this piece of work. Just saw a question pop up from Kate asking me who I am, what's my title. So I'm Director of Engagement at Ethos Urban, and by way of background, Ethos Urban has been engaged by Council to help run the online information sessions as part of this process. We'll be spending most of today's session providing you with an overview of the proposed planning scheme amendment in the form of two presentations. First, Council will explain how the amendment came about and what is being proposed and what it will mean. They will also explain their role and obligations to protect heritage. We also then have an opportunity to hear from the heritage consultant to understand their methodologies and approach in preparing this heritage study. And then in part two, the last part of the session, we'll be responding to the questions that we asked you to send through when you will have registered for this session. And we'll have about 30 minutes at the end to hear Council's responses to these questions. I'd also say that you will have the opportunity in the chat function, which you will see just down at the bottom of your screen or your Zoom bar. There's just a button to click to get the chat bar up. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in there, and we will try to address those as we go through. Please note, purposes of today's session is not to respond to specific questions about individual properties. We're keen to hear general questions about the amendment, proposed controls and the process, and we'll then wrap up with next steps, including more detail about how you can provide your feedback, submission, or get in contact with Council officers for any specific questions or concerns that you might have. And a quick note that Council have now extended the dates for formal submissions to be considered. That's until Friday the 15th of October, and there'll be more about this later on in the presentation. Go to the next slide, please, Liz. I'm sure many of us have been doing video conferencing more frequently in the last 18 months, but just as a reminder, a few tips for this morning to make it a productive use of time for everyone. Please ensure your microphone is on mute. We invite you to use the chat function to ask any questions, and ideally, if you could wait until sort of the main presentations are done, as it's quite possible that those questions will be addressed through the content of the presentation and the FAQ part of this session as well. And please be respectful and considerate of others at all time. We do really appreciate you giving up part of your Saturday mornings to join us this morning, and we do want to make sure it's as useful a use of time for everyone as possible. Thanks, Liz. So now I'd like to invite Sophie Jordan, Acting Coordinator of Strategic Planning at Darebin City Council, to provide a bit more detail about the Thornbury Park Heritage Estate and proposed planning scheme amendment. This is going to be followed by a presentation from RBA, the Heritage Consultants. And just again, there's the opportunity at the end of the two presentations to ask questions. Thank you. Sophie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ross, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us here this morning. We do much prefer to do these kinds of consultations face-to-face, but unfortunately circumstances don't permit that. So yeah, thank you for spending this sunny Saturday morning online with us. As Ross mentioned, my name's Sophie. I'm the Acting Coordinator of Strategic Planning. We know this proposal's generated a lot of community interest, so we're hoping today that this can cover off on the why and how of this amendment and answer some of the questions that you might have, and that you can understand how the proposal might impact you. And as Ross mentioned, we're really happy to speak with people after this presentation about their individual circumstances. So to start off with the big picture about why heritage is important and why it should be protected. And I do want to preface this this part by saying that some kinds of heritage are better protected than others in our existing frameworks and legislation. So we know that you know, post-settlement European heritage has greater protections than sort of Aboriginal cultural heritage. And we know that there are some inequalities in that, and that's some feedback that's come through to us as well. So Council's really got a strong commitment to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we do work to address some of the injustices of the past. And we also need to operate in this system and acknowledge the value of the more recent heritage in Australia. So, oh, sorry. Back to that slide, Jess, thank you. So we hear from our community really frequently that heritage is important to them and that council should be doing more to protect heritage. And I just want to read a very small part of the Borough Charter, which is our kind of national guidance around how heritage places are protected in Australia. And so the Borough Charter says, places of cultural significance enrich people's lives. They're historical records that are important expressions of Australian identity and experience. They reflect the significant diversity of our communities, telling us about who we are and the past that has formed us in the Australian landscape. They are irreplaceable and precious. So again, we hear frequently from our community about the importance of this heritage, and we want to ensure this heritage is protected into the future. Council also has a duty under the Planning and Environment Act to enhance and conserve heritage places. So we have a legislative responsibility to protect places of significance. We've also recently commissioned a detailed heritage study, which Anthony from RBA worked on and we'll talk to a bit later, that has identified Thornbury Park Estate as being of historical significance to the city of Darebin. So we have a duty to protect this place under the Act. The other thing I just want to mention is that there are existing heritage places in Darebin and there are gaps in our current heritage framework. So we progressively work to update the existing heritage protections in the municipality. So we're doing this in Thornbury Park. We have another heritage amendment on foot along Heidelberg Road in the south of municipality. And over the next few years, we'll be reviewing and updating those other gaps in the municipality. Next slide, thanks, Jess. So I won't talk too much about the heritage significance in detail because Anthony will talk through that in his presentation, but this is Thornbury Park Estate. Many of you will be familiar with it. And the heritage overlay is largely based on the original subdivision of Thornbury Park Estate. Again, Anthony will talk a little bit more about this. Next slide, thanks, Jess, cheers. So this is just a bit of a timeline of how this project has come about. So in 2019, there was an initial heritage assessment done that identified this area as having heritage significance. And later that year, council resolved to undertake further work to investigate the heritage significance of this precinct and to seek interim controls while that work was being undertaken. That request for interim controls wasn't supported, and so we've done further work in 2020 as we resolved to do in 2019, and a detailed heritage assessment was undertaken. And it was in April of this year that council decided to proceed. So the formal decision to go through this process to apply permanent heritage controls was made in April, and we're now undertaking community consultation on those proposed controls. I'll talk a little bit more about next steps at the end of the presentation as well. Next slide, please, Jess. Thanks. So this is a bit of the technical summary of what council's proposing. So we're proposing to change the planning controls affecting properties in the Thornbury Park Estate via a planning scheme amendment. This planning scheme amendment proposes to permanently introduce a heritage overlay to all properties within the precinct and incorporate what's called a statement of significance into the planning scheme. So that is a document that outlines what it is about the precinct and the buildings in the precinct that are significant. And then there's sort of minor consequential changes that need to be made as part of this planning scheme amendment. Next slide, please. Where and how will it be applied? So many of you will be familiar with this map, which was sent out to all owners and occupiers in the precinct. So the heritage overlay is proposed to be applied to all properties within that precinct. There are different gradings of properties within the precinct. So the red are the significant properties. There's 5 of those. The green, there's about 70% of those are called contributory, and the non-contributory are grey, and that's about 30% of the properties. And I'll talk a bit more about what those heritage gradings mean. So a significant property is one that is has heritage value both on its own and as part of the precinct. So that's the highest level of local heritage value. Contributory precincts are those that may not be considered significant on their own, but they do contribute to the heritage value of the precinct. And then non-contributory buildings are those that perhaps are not original dwellings, or they've been altered to a state where they don't contribute to the heritage value of the precinct any longer. So they're what's called non-contributory. And the heritage overlay is applied to non-contributory buildings to ensure that any new development is respectful of the heritage value of the area. Next slide, thanks. So council has also sought approval for an interim heritage overlay. This is called Amendment C197. So this is applied to significant and contributory buildings within the precinct. And this is a standard approach across the state. When there's a large precinct such as this and there's demonstrated development pressure, so we know that there is development pressure in this precinct, the interim heritage overlay prevents demolition of dwellings while these permanent controls are considered. And that's to try and protect the integrity of the precinct while the decision is made about those permanent controls. So it requires a planning permit in a similar way to the permanent heritage overlay. And I'll go through the sort of process for applying for permission in a minute. And so we're hearing from a few people who have current applications or are well progressed in their plans. So if you're in that situation and you're not in touch with us, please do contact us and discuss your situation, because the circumstances can vary quite a lot. So we want to be able to give you advice on your particular situation. Next slide. Thanks, Jess. So how will the overlay impact what you can do with your property? So essentially, the overlay means that you need to apply for planning permission from council for most external changes to your property. So for some people, this may mean an extra step. Most works you'll need to apply for a building permit. This may add an extra step. For some properties in the precinct, you may already trigger the need for a planning permit. There's a number of properties that are in what's called a special building overlay. So it may add another step to your permissions. For significant and contributory buildings, demolition is discouraged. If there are some instances where there are exceptions to this, for example, if there are significant structural issues, that's an important consideration for council in determining whether or not to grant a permit. So we do have a bit more info about that in some of the questions that have come through, but that's a relevant consideration for us. And if you provide evidence from a structural engineer that the building is not structurally sound, it's a really important consideration. And we consider that on a case-by-case basis through that permit process. For significant and contributory extensions to the rear are generally permitted, but they need to be in keeping with the surrounding precinct. For those non-contributory buildings, those 30% grey buildings, demolition is generally permitted, and new development again needs to be sympathetic to the surrounding heritage precinct. And there are exemptions for some minor changes, so things that don't impact on the appearance of the dwelling, some things to the rear like a deck, pergola, are exempt from needing a planning permit. So that we want to emphasise the heritage overlay doesn't mean you can't do anything to your property. It means that you need to apply for permission for external changes, and that any changes you propose need to respond to the heritage value of the area. So a summary of the planning permit process, and there's lots of good info on our website about this process as well. Before you lodge, we'd encourage you to have a pre-application meeting. So that's where you meet with council officers, talk about your plans, and we'll provide some preliminary feedback. And that's to identify any major issues before you lodge a planning permit application. There's no cost to do that, and that's you can book through our website. Then lodge an application, you provide plans and a report. The application is considered against there's a preliminary assessment done against the requirements of the planning scheme. The cost to lodge an application varies based on the cost of the proposed development. So if your development's less than $10,000 in value, the cost is $200, $202, and then it goes up to about $1,500 if the value is more than $1 million. So it varies based on the cost of works. Council may then request further information and request that information be submitted. And council aims to make a decision in 60 days. If we need to request further information, that sort of stops that clock. We don't always need to request further information. It's just if something is missing from the application. The proposal may need to be advertised. If there's going to be impacts on surrounding properties, then it needs to go through an advertising process, and your neighbours can lodge objections to the proposal. And there's a cost for this as well in terms of sending letters and providing signage and things like that. That's around $170. That goes up to if there's more people that need to be notified. And then council makes its decision. So council needs to consider any objections, considers the application against the policies in the scheme, and council makes a decision to either grant a permit with conditions, or refuse the permit. Then either the applicant or an objector can appeal council's decision and take the request that VCAT review the decision. And so then a hearing takes place, and VCAT issues another decision, and they may choose to uphold council's decision, or vary it, or make a new decision. So we've had some questions over the past couple of weeks about how an application would be assessed. So there's policy at different levels that council considers in assessing an application. So there's broad state policy about conserving and enhancing heritage places. We'll put this presentation online too, so that you can go and click on the hyperlinks and view those policies. There's local policy that discourages demolition, encourages the retention of heritage elements, and ensures development is sympathetic to the surrounding area. The heritage overlay, we consider the impact of the proposal on the significance of the property, and the impact on the broader precinct. So, and the appearance, location, bulk, and form of the development, and the impact of that on the heritage precinct. The statement of significance identifies heritage elements that need to be retained, and these are also considered in decision making. So Anthony will talk a little bit more about that statement of significance, but things that are in there include the single story dwellings, consistent setbacks, roof forms, materiality and architectural details. Thanks, Jess. Great, I'll now hand over to Anthony from RBA to talk a bit more about the precinct. Thanks, Anthony.
Hello, everyone. My name's Anthony Hemingway from RBA Architects. We were engaged by council to undertake the heritage review of this area, and there'd been some preliminary work has been outlined by Sophie, undertaken by another consultant, and we broadly conformed with their recommendation. However, the boundaries changed a little bit, and I'll speak about that shortly. RBA have extensive experience in assessing heritage properties across Melbourne and regional Victoria over the last couple of decades. And the methodology used is outlined in a plan practice note called Applying the Heritage Overlay. And that's the approach we always follow. And it's also underlined, importantly, as Sophie has also mentioned, a document called the Borough Charter, which is the leading document, and it's internationally recognised document too. And it's been other countries around the world have kind of based some of their heritage philosophy upon it. And it's a very important document which outlines kind of the philosophy and processes about heritage assessment and management. Next slide. Next slide, Jess. Oh, yeah. Methodology. So the area was inspected. We walked up and down every street and some of the surrounding areas just to confirm that there were no other parts that might be relevant. And as a result of that, we found that there was a lot of consistency with Miller Street on the south side. Then this was actually part of the original estate boundary. So yeah, the estate boundaries were along the south, included the south side of Miller as far as the north side of Smith. The south side of Smith was actually part of a separate and slightly earlier subdivision. It had there had been a few Victorian buildings in there. They have been lost, and it has a much more mixed character. So it actually was a separate subdivision. So it might seem odd that one side of one street is included and not the other, but that's the basis. It's to do with the subdivision and the consistent development that has occurred across this precinct area. So subsequent to that, we've done that inspection, and then undertaking our research has confirmed, sort of narrowed this down to this precinct area according to the subdivision. So an important thing in the assessment process is against the HERCON criteria, and I'll go to those shortly now, but there are 8 criteria, and they're widely used across the country. And they're to do with historical significance or aesthetic significance, social significance, sometimes technical significance, rarity, sometimes an association with a special person or group. We've undertaken subsequent inspections to, kind of confirm our position. We also had looked at against other overlays within Darren and other precincts, and there was nothing of this scale. This is an unusually large precinct, and it's not typical probably to recommend such a large precinct, but there is such consistent development and history across this precinct that it made sense to have the boundaries as they are. Each building was graded, which sort of undertook, during our review, we undertake an assessment of each building to sort of establish the intactness or integrity of each building, and accordingly a grading's applied. This is a precinct where there's a lot of modest timber dwellings, and they're not sort of high-end architecture. Obviously, there's only a few have therefore been picked out as the 5. There's only 5 significant buildings, but the effect of this is a cumulative of these modest scale buildings, and very much reflect the history of the area. And the statement of significance was prepared about what is significant and why and how. The next slide, yep. So just a quick overview of the history of the area. This part in Thornbury, Northcote at the time, originally, was divided up into very large farm holdings in the order of 180 acres. So these were long farm allotments which extended from the river up to High Street. An important local man, Job Smith, came to consolidate a couple of large holdings in the mid-19th century, and he established a house which stood until about the mid-20th century down on High Street on the rise there. Smith Street and sort of behind Hill Street. It was called Marybank initially, and then became Thornbury Park. And it remained undeveloped. So his holdings did extend down to High Street, and he sold off the parts from St. George's Road to High Street a bit earlier, but the rest of it just stayed. There's this huge holding with no development on it beyond the farmhouse until about 1911, which proceed to. So maybe the next slide, Jess. So the train, the impetus for development in this area was the extension of the train system. So that first started in 1901, but it wasn't until about 1920 that we actually really, with the tramway and the further extension of the railway lines that it really kicked off. But in we're missing a one. There's meant to be 1911 with the subdivision of the Thornbury Park Estate was undertaken, and it was very much developed as working class housing. And there were kind of like, very much like what you do, you have these sort of land and house packages, and they were offered by a firm, Dunlop and Hunt, who worked across Melbourne in building a range of buildings for sort of high end. So you can see on this map here the extent of the Thornbury Park, which covers just about the whole area, except for the corner sort of down around Hill Street. But that was another subdivision that occurred at the same time, part of another subdivision that occurred at the same time, but never sort of seemingly had a name that we've been able to come across. So you could, from this map, you can see that the northern, of that map, you can see how maybe just go back, Jess, sorry. On that map, so the north side, so the south side of Miller Street's in the subdivision, and the north side of Smith Street, but not the other sides of both of those streets. So that helped us sort of define the boundary on those streets. In the next slide, Jess, thanks. So as I was saying, the improvement, so the land was sold, offered for sale in 1911. The first titles date to 1914. There was just a little bit of development in the Federation period, and that tends at the late Federation period. So that's from around 1901 to World War I, and the interwar period is between the two wars, the First War and the Second World War, for people who may not be so familiar with that terminology. So most of the land had been sold by the 20s and was very quickly developed in the 1920s with the expansion of the transport network. And while most of the Federation period houses are at the east end up towards St. George's Road, the interwar ones are sort of broadly throughout the precinct. And it continued there's a lot of 1920s housing. Then, so a large percentage was developed by the end of the 20s. Then into the 30s, there's just the odd house that's built. There's quite a few on Miller Street though. And these houses tend to be brick rather than timber. So there's kind of this progression as, I guess, the area presumably becomes more affluent. And you find that with the post-war phase, most of those houses are brick. And they tend to be down the west end, west of Comus, but there are a few scattered throughout the rest of the precinct. So once again, we've got, we know local builders were erecting some of the houses in the area, and some were provided by the State Savings Bank scheme. And that's the only image we've got so far of a house in the precinct is there from 1932. So you can very much see the original fence there. That would have been the standard fence in the area. You see the tiled roof. Not a lot of the tiles have been replaced on a lot of houses probably. Many of them probably did have a tiled roof. And you sort of get a sense of the color scheme too. So like the dark, so if you look at the window on that faceted bay there, you see the sash has got a light color, but the framing has a dark color. And that's quite a common approach during the interwar period. Next slide, Jess. So by 1946, when this area was taken, a substantial part of the estate had been developed, mainly the areas I was saying, east of Comus Grove, and you can just see that area west of Comus Grove is fairly undeveloped, and not even all the roads are defined. They're sort of just goat tracks or, unmade roads anyway. you can actually still see, so just below, I should put an arrow there, but see where the whole street is. There's a house just below that, and that actually, it's meant to be Hill Street anyway. Just below that is the original farmhouse of Job Smith. So we're still standing at that time. Well, we have another area showing by 56, however, just about all the lots, vacant lots in the precinct have been developed. And I was saying before, these later phases tend to be brick houses, and a couple of, and some of the houses down that west end are quite substantial houses. Next slide, Jess. So just a bit of a quick overview of some of the house designs in the area, sort of standard designs. So the one there, an example at 92 Smith Street, is very indicative of the Federation period. It has sort of an asymmetrical format. It's got hood over the window. It's got the fretwork to the veranda. The chimneys are quite distinctive at that time. They're either red brick or red brick with some render on it. The gable end, like you can see at that front part, has got the vertical timber, which are called battens, and it's usually with rough cast sheeting. So it's a sheet, a metal sheet. It was often zinc, that had an impression as if it had a stony finish. And this is very much in keeping with the arts and crafts aesthetic that was really influenced a lot of design in the first part of the 20th century, including into the bungalow, 1920s bungalow. So the second house there, the top one, 127 Hutton Street. Unfortunately, sorry, the images have slightly covered over the text, but that's sort of a transitional house. Although it's 1920s, it retains a bit of a Federation period character in that the roofs are still quite steep. And there's also terracotta finials to the edges of the gable ends. Whereas the house at number 24 Keane Street is, a classic bungalow with that long, what's called transverse ridge. So it's parallel to the street. It's got the quite commodious porch. They usually mace, even if the house is timber, the porch has a low brick wall, maybe rendered, or maybe like this on piers with this tapered column above. Also, another distinctive character in the area was quite obviously the work of a particular builder was these spiral or helical columns to that where we see the tapered one at 24 Keane Street. They're these quite wide spiral columns. So number 30, we've also got just a few commercial buildings around the edge of the precinct, up on Miller Street, and a few on St. George's Road. Most of these date to the interwar period, with just a couple on St. George's Road to the late Federation period. Here's an unusual example on Miller Street where there's no parapet and you can actually see the roof of the building. Most commercial buildings at this time, you didn't see the roof. But this is sort of a reflective of a bit of an arts and crafts aesthetic, this roof expression. The next house there, 31A Comus Grove, there's a classic 1930s house with, once again, it's brick as compared to the timber ones we have seen earlier. And it's got a modern influence with the curved corners. At this time, you often get it's either clinker brick, and there's often some use of contrasting brick here, like we see the cream brick at the entranceway, the lintels just above the doorways there. And they're often the chimney's quite prominent to the front. And it's even got a curved window there on the right-hand side. And the last house we have here is sort of indicative of the post-war phase. We have quite a lot of kind of modern-ish houses from that phase too, but here's a rarer example of the Tudor revival that was also popular at the end of the war, but continued through after the war. And so here we have got this steep pitch gable with the corbelling, where the roof kind of comes back into the wall. Houses are compared to the ones from the 20s, the ones from the 30s and after the war tend to have smaller porches rather than these larger porches you see on the bungalows as in Keene Street. Yeah, and this is in that hillier ground at the west end of the precinct, the one in 5 Street. So yeah, thanks, Jess. Next one. So the criteria that were applied or the heritage values or heritage significance of this precinct related to 3 HERCON criteria. Criteria A is about its historical significance because it illustrates the emergence and rapid consolidation of Thornbury as a residential suburb during the early to mid 20th century. HERCON criteria D relates to the fabric. So a lot of the fabric is just as I was saying, I guess it's not high-end architecture, except for just a handful of places, like we see at 33 Comus Grove. So that's where these places are kind of more individual and distinctive. And so they're being defined as aesthetic significance. But most of the housing stock is fairly standard. It's quite economical. It was for largely a working class population. And it, gave these people an opportunity to have a house of their own on in a reasonable sized garden setting. So that just because a lot of the buildings are contributory, that doesn't diminish their significance at all. It just is indicative of the history and overall significance of this site. And it's the cumulative effect of all those contributory buildings which is important to the significance of the precinct. Next slide. Thanks. So just want to give a couple of, furthering on from what Sophie has already outlined about Council's approach to alterations to buildings. As she said, the incorporated document is one, and there are some exemptions outlined in that. As is common practice, alterations to non-contributory places will be permitted unless there's some other planning issue, but it won't be a heritage issue, most likely. Alterations to contributory places and or significant will generally be permitted if they're not visible from the front or the public realm. That is, they're generally located to the rear and behind the main body of the house. But I'll come to an example of that shortly. Alterations to the significant places, there's only 5 of them, will be more heavily scrutinised than the contributory because of their individual significance. And it's very important that these places retain their heritage appearance to the street. Alterations to the front facade of any contributory or significant building would generally not be supported. So if you wanted to, change the windows to a larger size or remove the porch or something like that, those types of changes would have a negative effect on the significance of that property and the broader precinct. Next slide, thanks. So people often wonder about fences. So there aren't a lot of original fences in the precinct. There's quite a number of as seen on the slide on the right there, of the original masonry fences. They're very low. They became popular in the 30s. So they tend to be towards the west end of the precinct and into the post-war period. Well, there are only a few remnant examples of what may be original or kind of reconstructed post and wire fences, like the one on the left there. So this would have been a very common fence type in the precinct at the time. Another common type would be like in the middle one, the timber picket. That was the standard fence type during the Federation period. But we weren't really aware of any original ones. These, timber fences have a certain longevity and are regularly replaced, but most of them are sort of replaced in a manner that's indicative of what the original would have been. The next slide, thanks. So here's some examples of some sympathetic additions to contributory places. Sorry, the text has moved around a bit there. But so 148 Hutton Street, that's a good example of how a taller addition, it's 2 stories, has been set back behind the original parts. So the original roof form would stay intact and the front of the building. And it's also quite nicely tucked in behind the line of the building, so it doesn't step out too. The one on the right there, 197 Hutton Street, that is a small scale addition to the rear, even though it's quite visible on because of the side street. From the front, it wouldn't be visible at all. And it's separated slightly. This is always a good approach to, if possible, to retain as much as possible and link it, with a glass link or something to a new section to the rear, to retain as much original fabric as reasonably possible. Next slide, Jess. Here's some examples where demolition would be straightforward. So any non-contributory buildings. So those buildings are either outside the period of significance, basically later than 1960. So there's an example of a 70s house at 78 Fife Street. Or if it's an original house, so this is clearly is a bungalow, but the additions have really overwhelmed the design and they've stepped forward of the ridgeline. That's a sort of a very negative outcome. Any additions to the rear should definitely be behind the ridgeline of the main ridgeline of the house. So demolition of those buildings should be straightforward. Next slide. Now here's some examples of some sympathetic infill in the area. The examples at 191 Miller Street. So there's a couple of townhouses that have gone in. And what's very good about this example is the architects or designers have picked up on the asymmetrical format that's sort of standard in this area. So there can be a bit of a tendency with townhouses to make them mirrored halves, or and hence symmetrical. However, there's very little building stock in the area that is actually symmetrical. There's usually an asymmetrical frontage. So this pair nicely does that. There's a slight difference between the 2 halves. And also what's good is the upper story is inset from the boundary as well. At the example at 42 Fife Street, that's a contemporary residence, a single residence. And whilst they've achieved a 2nd story, they've included that in the roof form. And whilst it is a little bit taller than the adjacent houses, it's set back in line with them and it doesn't overwhelm them. So this is another good approach to infill design. Next slide. And then I think it's over to someone else. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony, for that context, and thanks, and also to Sophie, and thanks for your patience, everyone. Just getting through some of the detail there. We will come back just in terms of the details on how to make a submission. Don't worry about that. And but now we did want to take this time for council officers to respond to questions sent through ahead of time, and some of those will also correspond to the questions we've seen in the chat as well. So we'll sort of we'll cover these as we go. And any questions the team can't answer straight away today would be taken on notice and followed up, and there'll also be some contact details to direct questions to about individual properties to the team directly as well. I'd like to invite Stevie Myers, Acting Manager of Strategic Planning. If go to the next slide, please. There we go. So Stevie is going to go through just responding to the questions that have been asked by people who when they registered for this session. And as we go, I'll also then come back to Stevie to address some of the questions that have come into the chat as well. Stevie, can I hand over to you?
Yes, thanks, Ross. So we've got a number of questions that have been asked earlier, so I'll try and get through some of them first, and then we'll see if there are any that have come through in the chat that we can address too. Obviously, we're running a bit over time, so I'll try and make this as quick as possible, but please be reassured that we will come back to you and answer your questions. If not today, then certainly next week. So we have had quite a few questions about why we haven't, why this is the first time that you're hearing about this. It's a very fair question, so I'll try and explain it in a nutshell. Yes, there has been a lot of work that we've been undertaking these past few years, starting with preliminary heritage investigations into the church manse back in 2018 and 2019. These heritage investigations tend to take a lot of time. It's a hell of a lot of work, and obviously it's a very large precinct, so we had to go out and inspect every property. So what happened was, with this permanent heritage overlay, council has only just made a decision recently to pursue this. So that was in April 2021, the 26th of April council meeting, that council has made a decision to proceed with this amendment. So normally, until that decision is made, we're not actually able to let you know whether or not we're going forward with it. So even though it seems like something's been happening for a long time, this decision has only just been made recently. Following that, we also needed to seek authorisation from the Minister for Planning, and this was received in June. So since June, we've been working quite quickly to try and get all the information and mail out to all of you that you would have received in your letterboxes. And this is our formal exhibition period, which was originally 6 weeks, and we're obviously now allowing late submissions too for another 4 weeks. So will owners be exempt from planning application fees? So all planning fees are set under the planning regulations. So it's not normal that anyone would be automatically exempt. However, there are circumstances in which you can apply for waivers. So we can certainly provide you with more information about that if you're interested in seeking that waiver. So how did the building at the church manse, which is 31 to 33 Cremis Grove, affect this amendment, and why not just protect the church manse? So yes, we did originally start investigating just the church manse. It is a significant property within the precinct. It's in a it's on a very large property, and it's got quite a large landscape setting, and it has been subject to sort of some development applications in the past by the landowners. And yeah, that kind of triggered the heritage investigation, so to speak. However, what was found is actually it's not individually significant in and of itself. So we weren't able to actually apply a heritage overlay just to this property. It did not stack up. However, during the course of those investigations, the heritage experts identified that actually the broader precinct, as part of this Thornbury Park Estate subdivision, is very much intact, and it could be the church manse could be significant as part of this broader precinct. So now that we've identified this whole precinct as having significance, council has a duty to protect it under the Act. So, you know, one property is not necessarily more important than others. The whole precinct is now considered to have heritage value, you know, in accordance with the gradings that have been identified. This is not unusual that heritage is discovered this way. We know, like Sophie mentioned earlier in the information session, there are gaps in Darebin's heritage framework, and we have a bit of work to do to try and address them. Normally what council would do is undertake a Darebin-wide heritage gaps analysis to identify precincts like this one that haven't been subject to a heritage overlay yet. But in this case, it just happened to be more of a reactive process. Another question which has been quite common is, why is there only protection on one side of the street? So that includes Miller, Strattle and Smith. So the proposed boundaries have been determined by heritage experts, and overlay can only be applied where there is heritage value, and this corresponds largely with the 1911 subdivision plan. It's also often the case that one side of a street might be more intact and therefore considered more significant than another. Will council offer a grace period for people who already are in the process of applying for permits and have spent money on this and who've only just found out about the heritage overlay? So once an interim heritage overlay is in the scheme, there's no grace period that we can allow because it automatically triggers that permit requirement. So there's no transitional provisions with heritage overlays. However, not every property in the permanent heritage overlay that we're consulting on right now will have an interim heritage overlay applying. So for example, non-contributory properties won't have an interim heritage overlay. So you essentially can follow the old rules, not the new ones, until this permanent heritage overlay is brought in. And there's also a few examples where, for example, we've already approved demolition permits or planning permits, which have been taken off the interim heritage overlay too. So if you think you fall into this category, it's very much a site by site kind of question. Please contact us and we'll get back to you with further information.
Sorry, Stevie, I might just jump in. I just want to acknowledge the time. I know we've gone a few minutes over and we do have a few more questions to get through and information we want to present. If you need to go now, all of these, this presentation is being recorded. And if you have a question that we haven't gotten to, please get in touch with us. Our contact details are on the website and on this presentation. So we apologise we're going over. We will get through the rest of the questions if people would like to stay, but if you can't, the presentation is being recorded. Thanks. Sorry, Stevie.
Thanks, Sophie. The next question. So can I apply to have my property exempted from the proposed heritage overlay? In a way, yes, you can make a submission through this planning scheme amendment process. So this allows you to provide information about your property that we might not know about. For example, if there's been modifications made to your property over time, if you don't believe the property is, you know, as old as what's been assessed by the heritage expert, you know, when it was originally constructed. These are the sorts of things that, or even considering from a broader perspective, whether you think that, you know, your street should be in the heritage overlay, or whether you think there's been too much development already that has affected its intactness. These are the sorts of things that could be considered in terms of application of the permanent heritage overlay. The other thing that could change is is even if a heritage overlay is applied to your property, your grading could potentially change as a result of your submission and this further information. So for example, going from contributory to non-contributory, for example. The other, I guess, important element is that you will also be able to, through the planning scheme amendment process, present your submission to an independent planning panel to make a case too. So next question, how does the proposed heritage overlay fit within Council's emergency climate plans? So we do not believe that heritage protection prevents anyone from renovating their building to a more sustainable standard. So it doesn't, heritage overlay doesn't prevent you from being able to make these improvements to your home. And certainly we've seen that to be the case with other heritage buildings all around Melbourne. The other thing is actually research shows that retaining existing buildings with heritage value actually has really significant environmental sustainability benefits. So for example, you're reducing energy usage associated with demolition, waste disposal, and new construction. It's a huge, the construction industry is, I guess, a huge contributor to waste in Victoria. So, you know, obviously reducing what will be redeveloped will help with that. There's also an embodied energy within existing buildings that'll be retained too. Next question. What if my building is not structurally sound or structurally unsound? So yes, this is a relevant consideration. So it's not something that normally is considered when we apply a heritage overlay. It's something that's considered through the planning permit process. So if you can provide information about during that process about why your property might be structurally unsound, and you've got a report from a structural engineer that provides this evidence, then that's something that can be considered by council and our heritage advisor. And you may be able to demolish and rebuild your property even with a heritage overlay applying and it being identified as significant or contributory. Another question is, you know, will council listen to those that do support this amendment? The short answer is yes. We want to hear everyone's views, not just those who feel they are adversely impacted. If you and your neighbours support the heritage overlay, then please make a submission and let us know about it so that we can really understand the level of support for this amendment. So that's all the questions I had beforehand, Ross. Do we have any more coming
Thanks,
through?
Stevie. Yes, we do have a number of questions that have come through on the chat as well, and thanks to everyone for providing those. I'll try and go through them, and I think I will try and pick out the ones that I don't believe have just been sort of answered through the course of the discussion. But if you feel like that's not the case, please feel free to throw it into the chat again. So first, we've obviously talked about, you've talked about sort of extensively the number 33, and there's a question of you know, is it reasonable to put an overlay on such a wide area for the sake of one property? Is this, which I think we probably answered, but a specific question of how that relates to the spirit and letter of the Act. Stevie or Anthony or Sophie, I don't know whether you've got any further comments on that question.
Yeah, it's a good question. And certainly we can understand how this could be perceived as a reaction to one property. But I mean, I hope you can all understand that the Darebin Planning Scheme protects, or considers or applies planning controls for all properties in Darebin. So certainly we have an obligation to identify new heritage properties and areas that should be protected. So, you know, when we're not out there to just try and protect one building, we're always looking if there's gaps in Darebin's heritage framework, and it just so happens that we've found one, and this is it.
Thanks, Stevie. There was another question which I think has been addressed, which is who initiated the original studies and why, which I think, you know, council have undertaken those studies. So if that hasn't been clear, please, I think that might have been Steve in the chat originally. There's a question around the significant costs associated with preserving heritage buildings, and why residents and owners should be required to carry that burden.
Yeah, look, it certainly might be the case that in some circumstances that retaining a heritage building might incur more costs than a sort of a demolition and starting again. You know, it can also be the opposite case. It's often a little bit cheaper for people to actually retain the front part of their house and do a renovation to the rear too. So it kind of, obviously that's a question about someone's individual preferences, and yeah, I guess we're certainly not intending to make you improving your homes more expensive. It's just a matter of preserving heritage properties for current and future generations. We really need to think beyond the individual financial consequences for people. It's about net community benefit.
Thanks, Stevie. New fence, would that require a planning approval?
It will require planning permit. So yes, it will trigger planning permit requirement. However, like Anthony mentioned, it's pretty rare in this estate that they're actually heritage value themselves. So it's just a matter of making sure that the new fence is appropriate for and doesn't impact on the broader heritage area.
Thanks. And similarly, proposals for a second dwelling or subdivision within a lot. Can you give any overview of how the overlay might affect that sort of situation?
Yeah, so again, this is probably something that really needs to be discussed on a case-by-case basis. Generally, if you're a significant or contributory property, you're encouraged to retain the significant heritage fabric, which is generally at the front of the building of the original dwelling. So it really depends on the size of your lot and whether you're able to, heritage overlay doesn't automatically preclude you from building more than one dwelling. That's certainly not the case. So for example, the Comus 31 to 33 Comus Grove Church Manse is on a very large lot. So it could be that even with the heritage overlay, the landowner could apply for building dwellings to the rear of that property. And that's the same with any other property in the precinct. In some cases, it might be that given the way that or the location in which your house is currently located, and the size of your lot might actually preclude you from building a dwelling to the rear too. So you'd have to talk to an architect about whether that's possible.
And I'm just trying to collect some of the sort of similar questions together. For a contributory dwelling, the rules that would pertain to an extension to the side of a house, typically done in the neighbourhood to incorporate an additional bathroom. Is there any additional information around what rules would apply if under that heritage overlay?
An extension to the side, was it?
Yes.
For contributory.
Yeah.
So generally, it's still fine to be able to build sort of to the side. Often it's about whether this new extension will have an impact on the significance of the dwelling and the streetscape. So, you know, we often see heritage properties with really fantastic modern side extensions being approved all over Melbourne, because that's been determined as being, I guess, acceptable in that instance. However, it could mean that you might need to reduce the impact of how it looks on your property. So it could be that you get asked to push it back from the front facade a little bit, set it back, and make sure that it's not as visible. So it really depends on the circumstances of your individual design and property, but we certainly encourage you to come to us for a preliminary session so that we can provide you that advice as early on in the process as possible.
Thanks, Stevie. And just then, there's just in the theme of extensions, rear second story extensions. Is it the expectation that they'd be hidden from the opposite side of the street? That's a question from Henry.
And could I jump in there maybe for a bit?
Please do, Anthony.
Yeah, a couple of about extensions. Look, some visibility can be fine. The preference is for non-visibility. That's usually straightforward. So that means if it's not visible, it should be very straightforward getting a permit. The more visibility you have, I guess, the more scrutiny it would come under. And you may, you know, there could have been there's, you know, depends what, it's a site by site situation, but as long as it's set back behind the main part and doesn't overwhelm it, some visibility may be acceptable. But once again, you need to discuss this with the council. The heritage advisor will review on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, the preference is for no visibility, but some visibility can be acceptable, and some sites may be very constrained, and so there's no other option. However, it's just about managing the impacts so it's as kind of minimal as possible. That's sort of the key approach and or underlying philosophy for the heritage advisor. And so, yeah, it's a case by case. It's hard to have overall rules, but limiting impact is the key kind of consideration the heritage advisor will bring to assessing an application. Is that it? So I thought.
So certainly the short answer is it doesn't need to be invisible. So it's fine to, if it's, you can still see it, it might be fine, but an assessment has to be made about whether that is in keeping with the heritage values of the streetscape.
Thanks, Stevie. Just going through, I mean, some of our colleagues are also answering questions in the chat as well. Just a clarification that's gone in there is that obviously works that are entirely internal don't require there are no internal controls, but then may require a building permit, but that's not proposed by the heritage controls. I'm conscious of time, and I do want to make sure that everyone gets the information around how to make a submission. Could we go to that slide? So you are able to make a formal submission on the proposed changes by post at the address listed there. via the council's website at www.yoursaydarabin.com.au, and there's a Thornbury Park Estate page there, and emailing the team at planningservices@darabin.vic.gov.au. There is, we'd encourage you, particularly with any additional questions or any questions pertaining to individual properties, to reach out and clarify anything that might not be clear, or anything that is still any questions you've still don't feel have been answered today. Again, this presentation will be uploaded to the site at that web address as well. And I think what the sort of things that you should think about including in your submission. Obviously, your views on the amendment, whether it's supportive or opposing, all feedback is really relevant and welcome. What would you like to see changed, if anything? Outline what changes you might request to the amendment, such as changing the grading of your property, moving your property from the heritage overlay. Any additional heritage information would be very useful as well, if you have it, about alterations to the front of the property in particular, and any other relevant or useful documentation that you'd like council to consider. And just to note, according to case law, following matters are not relevant considerations to council in terms of whether it determines a property in the heritage overlay. And that does include the potential impact on property value, or the property owner's ability to undertake alterations and additions to a home. Next slide, please. The next steps. Obviously, you've heard that the exhibition is extended. Through the rest of this year, council will consider all submissions, and if they can't be submissions that can't be resolved, issues that can't be resolved, there is the opportunity for it to go to an independent planning panel. In early 2022, we expect that planning panel hearing to take place. So people who've made submissions would be able to attend that hearing and present their case, and the panel will consider all submissions and make recommendations. And then around mid-2022, council will consider the recommendations of the panel report to decide whether request approval for the amendment from the Minister for Planning. So it's around around sort of middle of next year that could come into place. Again, for more info, if you are in need of any more information about the proposed planning scheme information, the council officers are able to meet with you to discuss changes to your property. You can find the additional information at the council website, or by emailing them, and equally you can call the team directly. I encourage you to take these numbers down. Naomi Kung, who's the Senior Strategic Planner, on 8470-8494, and Sophie Jordan, who we heard from earlier, on 8470-8461. And obviously that's during business hours. So we hope that we've not been able to cover everything today, particularly in relation to people's individual properties, but hopefully that's given you an improved overview of the context of the heritage overlay, and its rationale, and how it's going to be potentially implemented. And also, I again encourage everyone to take the opportunity to make a submission, and reach out to council directly with any further questions and clarifications as well.
Excuse me, Ross, could I butt in with a question, please? My name's Paul Viscotto. I'm here from one of the members in the meeting today.
Hi, Paul. I think we are. We've
No, I've got just one question for you,
up.
please. One question. Can you please repeat that the cost that we need to incur as homeowners is irrelevant? And can you please justify that as a council representative of your ratepayers?
I think if we can just skip back to that slide, please, Jess.
Hi, Paul. I'll jump in here. So this is something that we're talking about is in terms of the planning scheme amendment process. So the way planning controls are applied, it's about net community benefits. So often when planning, zones change or overlays are applied, they do have impacts to individual landowners, whether that is perceived to be good or bad, and it does often require a different process than what they had before. But there is a huge amount of case law where this has been considered at planning panel, that these particular considerations about the individual financial impacts of the proposed change is not a merits consideration for why the overlay should be applied at all. So it's about, but that's because it needs to be considered in terms of the net community benefit and the purpose of why we're proposing a change in the first place. So that's established within the Planning and Environment Act and relevant case law.
Thanks for clarifying that Stevie. And hopefully, Paul, that has not necessarily given you comfort, but at least helped understand that situation.
Well, just to give you guys a heads up, this basically means that I'm facing anywhere between $75,000 to $100,000 extra to save a facade that was grossly built inadequately during the time of the Depression. We've had structural engineers look at it and it can't be saved.
Yeah.
So can someone please explain to me why my home, I have to spend that money for whose benefit? What is significant about my home? Why does some...
Paul, sorry, I've just had to, we have made it clear that matters relating to individual properties, we're going to have to talk to you about individually. We really encourage you to reach out to the team after this session. It's good to have connected today, and clearly there's an opportunity to discuss that further with you. So there are a lot of individual circumstances here that council will be keen to understand through your submissions, and that's an appropriate way to have that conversation. Okay, I'm really conscious that we have gone a fair bit over time, and thank you for everyone's patience today. There's lots more questions, no doubt, and hopefully you've got the details and the avenues to pursue those, and also make your submissions. So from me and on behalf of the team, thank you again for your time and contributing to today, and we look forward to talking to you future through this submissions process. We'll leave just in case anyone needs those final details, you can get in touch via email and also call the team at the contacts listed there. So thank you everyone, and have a great day and stay safe.